The night had settled thick and quiet over the prairie, the kind of silence that pressed against a man's ears until his own breathing felt too loud. Elias Crow guided his horse slowly through the tall grass, moonlight silvering the scars on the land and the heavier scars inside his chest. It had been 3 years since his wife, Mary, had been lowered into the cold earth, and yet some nights, like this one, her absence rode beside him as tangibly as a second shadow. He hadn't planned to stop near the old creek, hadn't planned anything at all, really. He rode because riding kept the memories from piling up too fast, because motion dulled the ache. His horse, Ash, suddenly slowed, nostrils flaring, ears twitching forward. Elias followed the animal's gaze and felt his spine stiffen. Someone was lying on the ground beside the horse's tethering post, curled in on herself like a wounded animal seeking warmth. His hand went instinctively to the revolver at his hip, but something about the stillness stopped him. He dismounted quietly, boots crunching softly on gravel, and that was when he saw she was a woman, young, thin, wrapped in a threadbare shawl that did nothing against the night cold. Her hair spilled across the dirt, dark and tangled, and her face was pale even in the moonlight. For a moment he thought she might be dead, and the thought hit him harder than he expected. He knelt, reaching out slowly, and before his fingers touched her shoulder, her lips moved. What she whispered stopped his heart cold. Mary, the name left her mouth like a prayer, like a secret meant only for the dark. Elias jerked back as if burned. No one had spoken his wife's name in years, not out here, not like that. His pulse roared in his ears. He told himself it was coincidence, that Mary was a common enough name, but deep down he knew the way she'd said it, soft, aching, was exactly the way he used to say it when he thought no one could hear him. The woman stirred, eyes fluttering open, unfocused, fever-bright. She looked at him, or maybe through him, and for a terrifying second Elias thought he was staring at a ghost. Not because she looked like Mary, she didn't, but because the grief in her eyes was so familiar it felt like looking into a mirror. She tried to sit up, failed, and winced in pain. "Easy," he said, his voice rough from disuse and shock. He hadn't spoken much to anyone in months. She swallowed, lips trembling, and whispered again, "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to say it out loud." He demanded to know how she knew that name, but the words tangled on his tongue. She closed her eyes, tears slipping down her temples into the dust. "She was kind," the woman murmured. "She said you wouldn't turn me away." The world seemed to tilt. Elias stood abruptly, pacing a few steps, running a hand through his hair. This made no sense. Mary had been gone 3 years. She couldn't have met this woman. Unless, no. He crushed the thought before it could bloom. Grief played cruel tricks on lonely minds. Still, leaving her here wasn't an option. Whatever mystery clung to her, she was half-frozen and clearly injured. He lifted her carefully, surprised by how little she weighed, and carried her to the small line shack he kept near the creek. Inside, he laid her on his own bed, stoked the fire, and fetched water. As he cleaned the blood from a shallow gash on her leg, she watched him silently, eyes following his every movement with an intensity that made him uneasy. "What's your name?" he asked gruffly. "Clara," she said after a pause. "Clara Hale." Widowhood hung in the air before she even said it aloud. He could see it in the way she flinched at loud sounds, the way her hands curled protectively over her stomach as if guarding old wounds. When he asked where she'd come from, she shook her head. "There are men looking for me," she whispered. "If they find me, I won't survive another night." Elias straightened, jaw tightening. Trouble had a way of finding him, and he'd spent years avoiding it, hiding in routine and isolation. Yet Mary's name echoed in his mind, relentless. He wrapped a blanket around Clara's shoulders, his movements careful, almost reverent. "You're safe here tonight," he said, surprising himself with how certain he sounded. As the fire crackled and the wind howled outside, Clara's breathing slowly evened, exhaustion dragging her toward sleep. Just before her eyes closed, she reached out and caught his sleeve. "She loved you very much," she said softly. "She asked me to tell you, not to live like you're already buried." Her hand fell away as sleep claimed her. Elias stood there long after, staring down at this stranger who carried his dead wife's voice, his chest tight with fear and something dangerously close to hope. Outside, Ash stamped the ground, restless, and the moon slipped behind a cloud, plunging the land into darkness. Elias didn't know it yet, But by morning, the quiet life he'd built around his grief would be gone forever. Morning crept into the lined shack like a cautious guest, pale light slipping through the cracks in the wooden walls, touching the fire's dying embers and the still form on Elias's bed. He had not slept. He sat at the small table with a tin cup gone cold in his hands, eyes fixed on Clara as if she might vanish the moment he looked away. Her words from the night before replayed again and again in his mind, Mary's name, Mary's voice, Mary's way of seeing straight through the armor he wore. When Clara finally stirred, a soft sound escaped her throat, and Elias stood so abruptly his chair scraped the floor. She blinked, confused, then memory flooded her eyes, and she tried to sit up. Pain stopped her, and she hissed sharply. "Don't," Elias said, moving to her side. "Your leg needs rest." She studied him for a long moment, then nodded, exhaustion settling back into her bones. The silence between them stretched, thick with things unsaid. Finally, Elias asked the question that had been burning a hole in him since dawn. "You said my wife spoke to you." Clara's fingers tightened in the blanket. "I never met her," she said quickly, fear flickering across her face. "Not the way you're thinking." She took a breath, then another. "I was married to a preacher. A good man, once. After he died, his brother took everything, house, money, even my wedding ring. I ended up at the church shelter in Laramie. There was a woman there, older than the rest. Sick, but gentle. Her name was Mary." Elias's heart pounded. "Plenty of Marys in the world," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. Clara shook her head. "She had your eyes in her stories," she whispered. "She talked about a man who rode to escape his pain. About a ranch by the creek. About a horse named Ash." The cup slipped from Elias's hand and clattered to the floor. The room felt suddenly too small. "She said," Clara continued, tears filling her eyes, "that if I ever reached the end of my road, I should find you. That you would help me, even if you didn't know why." Elias turned away, gripping the bedpost until his knuckles went white. Mary had been sick before she died, weaker than she let on. Had she traveled while he was away driving cattle? Had she left behind pieces of herself he never knew about? Guilt slammed into him like a fist. He had loved her, yes, but love didn't erase absence. Outside, the sound of horses cut through the air. Shouts followed. Clara went rigid. "They're here," she whispered. Elias didn't hesitate. He grabbed his rifle, moved to the door, and stepped out just as 3 men rode into the clearing. Their eyes swept the shack with hungry intent. "We're looking for a woman," one called. "Widow. Stole what didn't belong to her." Elias met their gaze, calm and deadly. "You're trespassing," he said. "Turn around." The men laughed, but the laughter died when they saw his stance, his eyes. One reached for his gun. Elias fired first, into the dirt, close enough to spray dust over their boots. Last warning. They backed off, cursing, threats hanging in the air as they rode away. When Elias returned inside, Clara was crying silently. He knelt beside her. "No one's taking you," he said firmly. "Not today. Not ever." In the days that followed, Clara healed, and so did something in Elias. They talked, about loss, about mistakes, about Mary. One evening, as the sun bled red across the sky, Elias finally understood. Mary hadn't sent Clara to haunt him. She'd sent her to save him, from loneliness, from regret, from a life half-lived. Elias buried a small wooden cross near the creek, whispered goodbye to the grief he'd carried like a badge of honor, and turned back toward the shack where Clara waited, alive, breathing, real. And as their futures quietly began to intertwine, one truth became clear: love doesn't always end when someone dies, sometimes it finds a way to lead you home again. The weeks after the men rode away passed more quietly than Elias expected, as if the land itself was holding its breath. Clara's leg healed slowly, and with each passing day she moved a little more easily around the ranch, her presence weaving itself into the empty spaces Mary had left behind. At first, Elias kept his distance, unsure of where grief ended and something dangerous began. But loneliness has a way of softening hard edges. They shared meals by the fire, spoke late into the night, and sometimes sat in silence that felt companionable instead of heavy. Clara told him about her life before, about love that had turned into obligation, about faith that had been used as a chain, about the night she fled with nothing but her name and Mary's words echoing in her heart. Elias listened more than he spoke, learning how to be present again. One afternoon, while fixing a broken fence together, Clara suddenly froze, staring across the field. Elias followed her gaze and saw dust rising in the distance. Fear tightened his chest, but this time Clara didn't shrink away. She stood taller, her hand brushing his arm. "If they come back," she said quietly, "I won't hide." Something shifted inside him then. He realized Mary's final gift wasn't just Clara, it was courage. The courage to love again without betraying the past, to protect what mattered now. When the dust settled and no riders appeared, Elias laughed softly, a sound that surprised them both. It felt like the first real laugh he'd had in years. That night, Clara found him at Mary's grave. She didn't interrupt, didn't speak. She simply sat beside him, her shoulder warm against his. "I think she knew," Clara said at last. "That you'd need someone who understood loss the way you do." Elias nodded, tears slipping free without shame. He wasn't replacing Mary. He was honoring her, by choosing to live. As spring spread green across the prairie, the ranch felt alive again. And as Clara's laughter began to echo where silence once ruled, Elias knew this was only the beginning of a story shaped by pain, fate, and second chances. Summer arrived gently, as if the land itself were careful not to break what had only just begun to mend. The creek ran fuller, the grass stood taller, and the ranch breathed again after years of quiet endurance. Elias noticed the changes the way a man notices the slow healing of a deep wound, not all at once, but in small, undeniable signs. Clara had taken to waking early, her limp nearly gone now, humming softly as she swept the porch or fed the chickens Mary had once cared for alone. That sound, simple, human, did something to Elias every time he heard it. It reminded him that life did not wait for grief to loosen its grip, it kept moving, inviting those brave enough to move with it. One afternoon, a letter arrived bearing the seal of Laramie. Clara's hands trembled as she opened it. The men who had hunted her were gone, one jailed, the others scattered. The threat that had followed her like a shadow was finally over. She let out a shaky laugh that turned into tears, and Elias found himself pulling her into his arms without thinking. She fit there naturally, like she had always belonged. When she whispered thank you, it wasn't just for protection, it was for belief. Days later, a storm rolled in fast and wild. Thunder cracked overhead as rain slammed against the roof. Clara startled, memories flashing across her face, and Elias took her hand, grounding her. In that moment, he understood something vital. Love wasn't a lightning strike that erased the past. It was shelter. It was standing firm while storms passed. When the rain eased, they stepped outside together. A rainbow arched faintly across the sky, fragile and brief. Clara smiled, eyes shining. "Mary used to say rainbows were promises," she said. Elias swallowed hard, then nodded. She was right. That night, he dreamed of Mary for the first time without waking in pain. She stood by the creek, peaceful, smiling, not in farewell, but in blessing. When he woke, the ache was still there, but it no longer felt like punishment. It felt like love remembered. By autumn, the ranch had become something more than a refuge, it was a home again. Clara planted a small garden near the creek, and Elias carved her name into a fence post beside Mary's favorite spot, not as a replacement, but as proof that the heart could grow without breaking. As the leaves turned gold and the nights grew cooler, Elias realized he was no longer living in yesterday. He was finally living now. Winter came early that year, but it did not arrive like an enemy. It settled over the ranch softly, blanketing the land in white, quieting the world the way a mother quiets a restless child. Elias stood on the porch one morning, breath fogging the air, watching Clara move through the snow with careful confidence, her coat wrapped tight, her laughter bright against the cold. There was a time when winter had meant survival alone, long nights, empty rooms, memories that crept in like frost and refused to melt. But now, the cold no longer felt like punishment. It felt honest. One evening, as the fire crackled and shadows danced on the walls, Clara finally asked the question she'd been holding back for months. "Do you ever feel like loving again means losing her all over?" Elias stared into the flames for a long time before answering. "I used to," he said quietly. "But now I know something different. Loving you doesn't erase Mary. It proves what she taught me, that the heart doesn't close when it breaks. It opens wider." Clara's eyes filled with tears, but she smiled, and in that smile was relief, gratitude, and something that looked a lot like home. Later that night, they walked together to the creek, snow crunching beneath their boots. Elias carried a small lantern, its glow trembling in the dark. At the spot where he'd buried the cross months before, he knelt, brushed away snow, and placed a second marker beside it, not for the dead, but for the living. "This is where grief ends," he said softly. "And where choosing life begins." Clara squeezed his hand, understanding without needing more words. Spring would come again, he knew that now. Not because seasons always turn, but because he had finally allowed himself to turn with them. As dawn broke the next morning, sunlight spilled over the ranch, catching on frost and turning it into fire. Elias realized then that fate hadn't brought Clara to his horse by accident, nor had Mary's whisper been a ghostly trick of sorrow. It was love's last instruction: don't stop living. And as Elias and Clara stood together, facing a future neither of them could have imagined alone, one truth rang clear: sometimes the dead guide us not toward the past, but toward the life we were meant to live. If